Hi everyone, welcome. But first, before we start, please a huge round of applause for Stephen Warner. Spectacular and beautiful organ music. So, baseball bats and automobiles, as American as apple pie. However, history has shown us, and including now, that the definition of American, for some folks, does not include people that look like me. The true story you're going to hear today took place nearby in Detroit. It involved a baseball bat. It involved a conflict around automobiles, American versus Japanese. It involved a Chinese man who was 27, 8 days away from marrying the woman of his dreams. It involved two men, two auto workers, a father and stepson, who assumed that this man at his, right before his wedding, was Japanese and decided to do something about that because they were angry about the state of American auto industry compared to Japanese auto industry. So they ended up actually beating him to death. And when they got their time for punishment, their punishment is actually just basically a slap on the wrist. And the reason why is pretty much epitomized in the quote from the judge when he said in his verdict, "These are the type of men that don't deserve to be in jail." So overall, like these types of race hate crimes, they just need to stop. I think we all know that. But statistics-wise, from March 2020 through December 2021, there was over 10,900 attacks on American Asians and Pacific Islanders that was logged in the United States alone. This particular story that you're gonna hear about is just one that happened 40 years ago. And that 40 years ago, the attack actually happened this past Sunday, if we just go based on calendar time. Vincent was actually in a coma for 4 days, and the day that he died was today, which is why we're actually holding this showing here today. Before we press play and let you watch this documentary, it's just disturbing for me that 40 years ago this happened over an automobile conflict. At that time I was 8 years old, and as of 2 years ago, that could have been me, right? When instead of the conflict being over automobiles, it's actually over this virus we're all battling called COVID. So before we start, there's actually some big, huge thanks that needs to occur. First off, this would not have happened without these two wonderful ladies to my right. First, Aubrey Martinson from Cultureverse. Yeah. Lisa Save from Do Good Work and Synecdoche. Russ and Ellen from Michigan Theater on the staff here. Like, this would not have happened. As you can see, beautiful facility, and it's a total gem in this Ann Arbor area. There's a few other folks, and I'm sorry, I do have to read their names. Our panelists that will be happening here on the stage after the showing. There's Manan Desai, who's gonna be our moderator, Chen An Wan, Dim Mang, and Francis Kai Hua Wang, who's also actually up here on our stage and was paramount and helpful in getting this panel actually organized. I don't know if all of you had a chance to see, but there's a beautiful kazuna tree out in the lobby, and that happened because of the generosity of Celeste Shimoda-Gober from Rising Voices, Chen An Wan again from Islands, Zozette Gear from Detroit Public TV, and Dorothy Hernandez from WDET. And of course, we do have to thank the filmmakers. That would be Christine Choy and Renee Tajima-Pena. I mean, without them and taking the leap to make this story be known in the 80s was a huge, huge step for them. There's a lot of risk, and they just did it. And of course, last but not least, we have to thank all of you. You came out here on an evening during the week to spend time to watch this film. And this is not a feel-good film, right? This isn't Top Gun Maverick, but we're here, and it's a story that needs to be told and a story to be heard, so it's greatly appreciated that you came out for this. We do have some donations. The QR code that's up here, which I actually tested from the back of the theater and actually works, which is amazing. There's also a QR code on a billboard that's actually up in the front entryway, that the funds will actually get split between the Stop AAPI Hate nonprofit, and also for Frances with her book that she has, which is an anthology that she compiled of artists and activists on how this particular incident shaped their work and their stories and their lives. So I think one of the things that I just want folks to kind of leave here is, remember that you have the ability to use your voice, and always use it for positive change. And so let's just go. But first we want to have Frances, who's going to read a couple poems that are just really heartfelt and moving. Frances?
Hi, thank you for having me. My name's Frances Kaihua Wong. I live in Ann Arbor, and I wanted to share 3 poems with you from this book that I'm working on that he just talked about. This first one is by a poet named Brian Talwara, who grew up in the area. He was a he was in Rudolf Steiner class number 1, as his claim to fame in town, but it's called Ypsilanti 1982. In 36 years, I barely spared a word about my days in Ypsilanti, known chiefly for giving us Iggy Pop, an obscure pioneer in continental drift. And I was watching the 9 o'clock news with my father in our living room, as was the family habit. I was 9, eating a Baby Ruth in June, when a picture of Vincent Chin flashed on screen with a discussion of murder, Japan, and the Motor City. My father said not to take it personally. We were going to have a barbecue with our blue-collar neighbor on Saturday, once he was done at the Ford factory. Our other neighbor across the way with the tall, bottle-blonde daughters was a Baptist preacher, fond of discussing Pearl Harbor with me every other day, because I couldn't tell him a thing about Laos. So, I forgot to mention, Brian Talwara is the Lao American Poet Laureate in Minnesota now. And so the 3 poems I picked from the collection are to show the breadth of how many people are affected. It's not across ethnicities, across race. So the second piece is by the poet Ravi Shankar, not the Ravi Shankar, this is the poet Ravi Shankar. And also, as I go on, I forgot to mention, in the spirit of the old beat poets, if there's something that resonates with you, feel free to snap your fingers, clap your hands, shout out. Feel free, that's fine. So this is by Ravi Shankar. It's an excerpt from Latin for New World Order. In a letter, the presiding judge wrote, "These weren't the kind of men you sent to jail," which begs the question, what kind of men do you send to jail? I'm a a Tamilian Brahmin American. I'm also a man of color who has been slurred, mocked, stereotyped, profiled, arrested, and idealized as a guru. Even if I don't look like Vincent Chin, I've walked miles in his Adidas. In death, he reached across ethnic lines to help shape multiracial alliances that advocate for civil rights, which is why I don't mind being called a POC. It signifies strength and solidarity, a reassurance that those of us born with skin darker than a grocery bag, a heritage traced back to conquest and colony, still have a community who can collectively speak discontent to privilege with greater force. We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. What about the family of Srinivas Kuchibhotla, an affable Indian-American engineer from Hyderabad, shot dead in Olathe, Kansas by a bar patron who mistook him for Iranian, shouting, "Are you legal?" and "Get out of my country, terrorist," before murdering him in cold blood? He could so easily have been me, born the oldest of 3 in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s. That's why #Black Lives Matter. That's why #Human Rights. That's why I rep POC, even when it's maddeningly PC, imprecise, even when it overgeneralizes and essentializes. I make my claim. And this third piece is mine from my new book, just out at Wayne State University Press. You cannot resist me when my hair is in braids. If you know anyone at the Washtenaw Reads, or the Great Michigan Reads, tell them. I have books too. So this is my piece, Finding Home Between the Vincent Chin Case and COVID-19. First, I heard from the high schoolers at Chinese school that all their parents were stocking up on rice and bottled water. Then I heard about the fights breaking out in the California Costcos. Don't mess with Asian aunties. Weeks later, the rest of America went crazy for toilet paper. But I am the child of immigrants. So while y'all were hashtag quarantine baking sourdough bread, I was sprouting bean sprouts, grinding soy milk, coagulating tofu from scratch, sewing masks. Old school. Asian students say coronavirus is spreading discrimination at Michigan State University, Lansing State Journal. Coronavirus graffiti at park leaves Asian American woman scared, frustrated, Royal Oak Tribune. Local groups respond to aggression against the Asian community, WZZM Grand Rapids. When I first came for grad school, the only thing I knew about Michigan was that that was where Vincent Chin was killed, and I was afraid. 27 years old, Chinese American, a bachelor party, a baseball bat. It's because of you, little, that we are out of work, said the white auto worker. These aren't the kind of men you send to jail, said the judge. A $3,000 fine. All these years I've lived in Michigan, I've held it at arm's length. Felt like I did not belong. Waited for the day I could finally return home. Then I learned about the people who came together across differences of race and ethnicity, demanding justice for Vincent Chin. The people who still speak out to defend others today. The people who would craft a new answer to the question Vincent Chin's mother asked all those years ago. What kind of law is this? What kind of justice? Chinese Americans in Michigan donate more than 200,000 masks, supplies, Detroit Free Press. Michigan leaders encourage reporting of anti-Asian American hate crimes amid COVID-19, WWMT, West Michigan. Opinion, hate has no home in Michigan, especially in coronavirus crisis, Bridge Magazine. As the hashtags surge, hashtag stop AAPI hate, hashtag wash the hate, hashtag I am not a virus, hashtag hate is a virus, hashtag stand against hatred, and Big Gretch starts trending. I feel, for the first time in all these years, like I belong here, like I am not alone here, like this can be home here. Even as the last snowstorm of the season sweeps in May. But in choosing to call this place home, we have to make this home for all of us, all our communities. Hashtag Asians for Black Lives, hashtag Flint Water Crisis, hashtag Run with Maud, hashtag Justice for George Floyd, hashtag Justice for Breonna Taylor, and now hashtag Justice for Patrick Lyoya. What will you do to create community, the beloved community, where no mother ever has to ask, what kind of law is this? What kind of justice? Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so very much. My name's Ellen. I'm with the Michigan Theater Foundation. I want to thank you all for your patience. They're wanting to restore Who Killed Vincent Chin for obvious reasons. So the film is so old, we did the best we could, but unfortunately the sound did not totally line up. I do hope, though, you got the meaning and sort of the somberness of the issue, but I want to apologize for the sound. Again, it's old film, there's not much we can do, but they are working on restoring it, so hopefully we can have you back again when that is restored. And now it is my absolute pleasure to present our amazing panel this evening. Please come on out, everyone. Thank you so much.
everyone. So thanks for being here, and thanks for still being here, even though that I know there was this AV issue, and we were going to talk a little bit about the restoration, the efforts behind the restoration of the film. I wanted to just introduce quickly our panelists. At the far end, you guys already met Frances Wong, who is a journalist, essayist, speaker, activist, and poet. She has worked as a lecturer in the APIA Studies program at Michigan and is currently communities correspondent for the PBS NewsHour out of Dearborn and Detroit. She's also the 2019 recipient of the Knights Arts Challenge Project, and her most recent book, which you guys heard, You Cannot Resist Me When My Hair Is in Braids, was published earlier this year with Wayne State University. Next up, Frances, is Dim Mang. Dim is a community organizer with Rising Voices, an Asian American nonprofit committed to building power with Asian Americans in Michigan. Dim is also a graduate of U of M and serves as the at-large vice president of APALA, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, and helps run a mutual aid network and fundraiser to aid anti-coup protesters in her home country of Burma. And next to me is Chin En Won. Chin En is an interdisciplinary artist, designer, and educator based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He runs 1473, a record label specializing in improvisation, electronics, and collaboration, and is also a founding member of Island, a performance collaborative comprised of AAPI movers, artists, and collaborators. He currently sits on the board of directors for the American Citizens for Justice, which was featured so much in this film. And very quickly, my name is Manan Desai. I am the current director of the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program at Michigan. So I wanted to start with a question for all of our panelists, and we can maybe just kind of work our way from the right to the left. And that is, if you could speak a little bit about the legacy of Vincent Chin. This is the 40th anniversary of Vincent Chin's murder. There have been events in Detroit. There's been a lot of national stories and so on. And we learned a lot about the activism, the kind of amazing activism that followed in the immediate aftermath of Chin's death, but also, that's continued over the last 4 decades. So I wonder if each of you could just quickly reflect on the legacy of Vincent Chin, how it's impacted your life, your sense of self, and your work.
So on a personal level, right, before I was born and raised in California, and I came to Michigan for graduate school, and before I came here, the only thing I knew about Michigan was that that's where Vincent Chin was killed. And I drove a Toyota at the time, and I was asking everyone, well, should I sell my Toyota before I come out here? Is it safe? And and then my neighbors who are Japanese American told me all the stories about when they came on business trips in Detroit and how they had to make sure they rented an American car. And it's this whole ordeal, and I was really quite frightened to come. And but then university offered me a really big scholarship, so I came, and I ended up taking the first Asian American literature seminar offered at the University of Michigan. Graduate seminar, and it was amazing, changed my life. I learned all sorts of Asian American history, including all the details of the Vincent Chin case. And then later on, I ended up looking for ACJ. I remember driving up and down in Southfield somewhere, looking for their office, and no Google Maps in those days, no maps even. I just drove it's like one of those really long streets. But anyway, now I'm distracted. But I think if you just look at the facts of the case, and later if you have questions, I know all of them. It's really easy to just be so depressed by all of this, right? But what the interesting thing is, the community came together to realize that, there's, at the time, there wasn't really this sense of Asianness Am I jumping too far ahead? Okay. The concept Asian American was created in the late 60s by Asian American student activists, but it hadn't really trickled down to the rest of the community. Everyone just kind of stayed in their ethnic enclaves, separated by languages, by old political differences, by culture, by religion. There's all sorts of reasons. Everyone's different. This whole Asian category, I mean, Asia's a big place. And so people came together and realized we've got a lot more in common than not because of our experience in America, the way we're treated in America. And so this concept of Asian America was created, and people came together and they started speaking out for each other and standing up for each other. And I think that's such a powerful lesson to learn. And it's when we see this every day today, with the Black Lives Matter, people standing up of all races, standing up together. And we see it after 9/11, the Japanese American community was the first group to stand up in solidarity with the Arab American community, Muslim American community, and say, you are not alone, we're in this together, and we'll stand for you, stand with you. And then today, with the COVID-inspired anti-Asian violence, there's a lot of groups coming together and saying, okay, this is not right, let's stand together. And I think this is how we create community, and this is how we work together to create something better for all of us.
Going off of that, I know for myself, my name is Dim. I use they, she pronouns, and I'm a community organizer for Rising Voices. One of my colleagues is here, and we would not exist without the story, the legacy, and the activism of Lily Chin and the life of Vincent Chin. So we were started in 2019 by a group of women, non-binary folks in the state of Michigan who realized that in so many Asian American communities, women, non-binary folks, and femme-identifying folks are the pillars of their communities. They are often the backbone. We see this with Lily Chin, who was essentially forced to hold the mantle of the legacy of her son. And yet in so many spaces, women are forgotten. And so the founders of our organization wanted to start a group, a community, an activism community who could use that as our values and kind of go forth with that legacy of activism that is really strong in Michigan among Asian American community members. But on a personal level, I learned about Vincent Chin quite late, which I think is a testament to how much education and ethnic studies is needed in our schools in America. So I was actually born in Burma, and my family and I immigrated in 2005 because we're an ethnic minority, a Christian ethnic minority in a majority Buddhist country. And so we were displaced in the US because, just like Lily, my parents had these very optimistic dreams of America, which I'm sure so many children of immigrants can relate to. And yet life was extremely difficult for my parents and me for the first decade, and still difficult in some ways, but my dad worked in a factory, my mom cleaned houses, and so when I hear these stories of hard work and toil in the 80s, I know that so many of those things are still the same. And so when I came to UMich in 2016 for undergrad, and I first learned about Vincent Chin, I honestly cried. I think that was my first reaction. And yet, just like Francis mentioned, when I first went into the archives of the UAW for a work project, and when I first really looked into what the community did, who actually came together, what stories were being told, I was also mobilized. And I think there's this saying that is said a lot in activist spaces, especially in Black activist spaces, which is really strong in Michigan: let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair. And I think that is the ultimate legacy of Vincent Chin.
Thank you.
My first encounter with the Vincent Chin story was actually in person. My parents brought my brother and I to the Vincent Chin protests that you saw in the film in '83, and I was 6 years old, but I have a very visceral memory of that experience, of seeing all these different faces. You had Asian faces, white faces, Black faces, and my parents were, they came over with the wave of the late 60s, early 70s, like wave of Asian academics. So they've always been very politically aware, but this was the first time that I think they were politically active. And for them to take that leap, for them to take that step, has always really resonated with me. The other piece of history is the Tiananmen Square massacre, and that's the second time. But what it always demonstrated to me was that you have to step up. That for them to come out of their shell, for them to come out of their life and to actually publicly take a stand, it means something. It means a lot. And if you don't do that, you become very complacent and you become very used to your own silence. If you don't understand the power of your voice, if you don't understand what the power of your voice can do, then you can basically coast along and be okay with things. And I think what's really stuck with me as I've engaged with the Vincent Chin story over the years with this film is that people get away with things. As Francis said, this is not a happy story. This is a story of injustice. And what I think this film so pointedly showcases is all these different disparate, almost casual elements of the hate-mongering and the scapegoating of AAPI people for the woes of the auto industry and Detroit's woes. The politicians, the UAW, the auto industry itself, the press, who stoked all these fears, they've never apologized for it. They've always it's just been like kind of shrug and like, well, that's over. And, a guy died and that sucks, but, And we're currently living in a world where that has increased tenfold. That you have these these figures in the media, on social media, just saying awful things. Awful, anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, anti-people of color, anti-everything, and they just see what sticks. And it's far worse than it was then, and it's important for people to watch films like this to recognize that, for me at least, to know that everything is complex, that incidences like Vincent Chin come out of complex, it's kind of a sense of entropy, societal entropy kind of colliding, and it manifests itself into this singular moment, this tragedy. But if you don't look at it through a complex lens, look at all the different factors that kind of affected it and why it happens, it's gonna happen again. And we're living through it now, and things are grim. Things are grim that, being Gen X, we thought, in the 90s that it was all kind of like, hey, we're okay. It's not okay. We're far from okay, Just want to keep things light for you.
Yeah. One thing we were talking about backstage, this isn't the first time this panel has seen the film, and Francis sort of mentioned off the cuff that you always learn something new when you watch this film. I wondered if you guys could speak about your experience with the movie itself, and whether that's like the first time you saw it, or things that you are learning every time, or that kind of that you notice when you've watched this.
Yeah, I teach an Asian Pacific Islander American Civil Rights course and media course at the University of Michigan as a lecturer. And so I show this film every year, every class, and I've seen it lots and lots and lots of times. And I'm always impressed by how the students react at key moments, the way you guys did, right? I heard the laughs, I heard the gasps, and I heard the groans. I heard all that. The students hear this every year. And this film is so important for that reason, because a lot of, most, and I just wrote an article for PBS NewsHour where I interview Professor Desai, and a lot of people don't know about the case. So if I'm teaching a class of 75 students, say, University of Michigan, right? A lot of them, they're from here, most of them. I say, how many have heard of the course? Heard of this case? Maybe 5 people will raise their hand. And then I'll say, how many people learned of it outside of an Asian American Studies class? And then 4 of them will go down. So students are learning about this case by watching this film. And this film is really, this is the entry point for the students to learn about this case, and it's an entry point to learn about activism and anti-Asian violence overall. And what else? And then there's another film called Vincent Who, made by Curtis Chin, which is about how a lot of people don't know about the case, and yet when they learn about it, it inspires them to activism and action.
Curtis Chin was a U of M alum too, right? So.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I guess I kind of speak for Gen Z, older Gen Z. I don't know, I'm a cuspy. And this was my first time seeing the film all the way through. So I used to see bits and pieces of it in undergrad, and seeing it for the first time, I think even though I've read the case and I've done research for it at my work in undergrad, things like that, I think I'm still shocked by the white complacency. I think it's one thing to be angry at the killers, but it's another thing to see their friends, to see bystanders just give them a pass right off the bat. I watched that and I think it's surprising that I'm still shocked, but I think it goes back to, so much goes back to education, so much goes back to what you're exposed to, and as a person of color, I think, sadly, I think we've been exposed to so much, but also so much of my education stems from the fact that my parents went through revolution in their homeland. And I think that's something so many immigrant children can say too. So my parents left Burma because it was unsafe for us because we were minorities, and then they come here, and then what do they find? The same thing. And I think that is something, all those feelings were coming up as I was watching, all those feelings were coming up as they said there's no prejudice. I never said that. And then they're just given a pass, and it makes me think when white people or non-Asian people or just non-POC ask what you can do, I think often people want one tangible thing they can do, but it's in those small conversations, don't let people have a free pass. Hold people accountable right in that moment. And I think if we maybe if the killers had that opportunity, things would have changed, who knows? But I think so much goes back to accountability, and how accountability is so many times a community effort.
Yeah, I know, I actually just recently confirmed with my brother, I know we watched it when it was originally broadcast on POV in the late 80s, but I really actually didn't fully engage with the film until the late 90s in college. And that was when it was in the distribution limbo that lasted for a solid 30 years. And the only way for me to watch it then was to sit in my campus library in the old days, and you'd sit there with a VHS, and you could not leave the room, and you could press play, and then you had to immediately return it.
It's very Gen X.
That's a very Gen X. I mean, I could talk about microfiche too, if anyone really wants to hear about microfiche, many hours. But what struck me about the film is its immersiveness and its real sense of time and place. As Gen X, I remember the early 80s really well, and this film just brings it all back. The sounds of it, the way that the auto industry, that whole culture. I remember watching TV a lot, and just there was within pop culture too. There was the Michael Keaton was in a film about the Japanese auto industry. Gung Ho, yes, and Gung Ho. That was on TV all the time. It was on HBO all the time, and you just that kind of casual racism. It's just on TV, and you don't really think about it in any kind of critical terms as a kid. It's just prevalent within pop culture. So watching this film and its very nonlinear construction and its use of music and the way that it presents the contrasting narratives, I think that's why it's lasted, and that's why it's resonated, and that's why it will continue to resonate with audiences, is because it puts the question to the audience. It doesn't answer anything. The obvious focal point of the film is the fact that they got Ronald Ebens on camera talking about the crime, and you can just see the kind of, I'm gonna watch my language here, unpleasant person that he is, and his very obvious desperate attempt to mask that. And I actually just recently completed a short documentary segment for Detroit Public Television with Bill Kubota, where I got to interview Christine Choy and Renee Tajima-Pena and Juanita Anderson, the executive producer of it. And because when I was given this opportunity, I leapt at the chance, because this is such an important film, and it's such a unique film in the way that it's built. And just the obstacles that they had to overcome to make it, the years it took to make it, the funding, lack of funding, and then the fact that it was in a legal quagmire, for licensing quagmire for 30 years, it's incredible that this, it's just, anytime I sit with an audience with it, I think it's amazing. It's like Francis, people respond to it. It's a very emotional film.
And you would just,
And you can still, and you can see this documentary that Jen
right.
just made right now. Detroit Public Television, One Detroit, and they've recently made 3 short documentaries, but that's the best one.
It is. I agree. Thank you, Francis.
I just wanted to mention there are 2 microphones, and if you have a question, I think you could just kind of come up here and ask it. I'm sure you have many after watching this movie. One thing we were talking about backstage was, how in the world did these 2 filmmakers, Asian American women, interview, get into some of these spaces? And you actually asked them about that.
Yeah, so Christine Choy, she had made a number of films in the South about basically relationships between interracial relationships between communities. And she realized that when you really want access to the communities, you have to have the film crew look like the people that you're talking to. Otherwise, people don't open up. So one of the things that she did that was extremely savvy for Who Killed Vincent Chin was all the footage you see of the auto workers, that very immersive footage with the mud wrestling, with the bar scene. I still think, I've seen this many times now, I've edited, but I'm still shocked by that. How open they are to the camera crew. And which is why when I asked Christine, how did you get that footage? They made sure to hire 2 white male cameramen and tell everybody they were the filmmakers, and they're the ones who shot all that footage on the bus, interviewed them, and these guys were just oh, they're people like us, so they were just extremely candid. And that is, that just speaks to the kind of strategy that it takes to get the truth out of your subjects.
Yeah.
Also, I think safety, because I'd imagine an Asian woman could never interview that kind of white man.
But one thing is sorry, Francis. One thing that Renee said that for instance, they were able to get Ronald Ebens on camera was because he just assumed, what can they do? They're Asian women, they're meek, they're polite. What's the worst thing they can do? And Renee, if you watch the documentary segment, Juanita Anderson talks about Renee Tajima-Pena's interviewing style, which was that she would ask a question and just let the person talk. And there would come a natural point where the interviewee, Ronald Ebens, would stop talking, but then Renee wouldn't follow up. She would just let him, and then he'd just keep talking. And so that's when the truth would come out about what he actually felt. Because you can see it in the footage that initially he has a very careful, guarded answer, and then comes the stuff about and my daughter taught an Asian kid, and you can see that kind of anger, that seething anger, come through.
Yeah, Francis, it seemed like you were. No. So one of the things I was thinking about watching this tonight was, there are a couple of things. One is there's so much emphasis on the media and mediation, right? You see TV screens, you see a camera filming a TV, and to me, it's kind of struck me that they're playing around a lot with what are the narratives around Vincent Chin and how are they changing and who has a role to play in this, what was to unfold. And I guess this is a question specifically for Francis as a journalist. There's this moment in the film where there's a kind of shout out to journalism and the importance of, and specifically from Helen Zia, right? There's one characterization of the story that from, I think, Evans, that the media has actually created something out of nothing, and Zia pushes back on that. Helen Zia pushes back and says, no, it's really deep journalism. And I, as a kind of journalist for so long, and specifically working in ethnic media, I wondered if you had any reflections on how the film talks about journalism and the importance of the ethnic media and what role it's played in cases like this.
Yeah, so I've written for ethnic media most of my career. Right now I'm with a mainstream media outlet, but this is new for me. But I've always written for Asian American magazines and communities of color, and to tell these stories that usually are not covered by the mainstream media, or they're not told well, or they miss the point or whatever. And I think that ethnic media is really critical, that you have people who understand the community and understand the languages and understand, the power structures and know who to talk to, and don't get put off by perhaps accents or differences. Like at the time in the 80s, nobody really interviewed Mrs. Chin or her family. Everything in the newspaper was from the white community. And I think, they just didn't know how to do it, or it didn't occur to them to do it. And so we see a big difference now because news media are realizing we need people from the community to report on these stories and to tell these, and we also need to tell these stories. And you get a different result when you have someone from the community or who knows the community. So and then in terms of the pushing of the journalists, I think we can see this right now in what's happened in Uvalde, right? In the past, police come in as a people of authority, and the news media used to just say, okay, the police said this is the official report, this is what happened. But since Uvalde, very clearly, the journalists have been pushing back and asking other questions, and it seems every week we find out more information about that horrible day and what went wrong, and that's all from journalism. And so journalism is really important. And then also, I think the journalists who are there, a lot of them are Spanish speaking, and so they get interviews and stories that someone who doesn't speak Spanish isn't able to get.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. That's really kind of remarkable about that, just what you said, that no one was really interested in speaking to Lily Chin, and she's such an important part of Vincent Chin's story. And Dim, you were saying that it was kind of an inspiration for Rising Voices too. I guess, Dim, I do kind of have a question directed towards you as an activist working right now. I wondered if you could reflect, it's been kind of mentioned already a little bit, but reflect a little bit about, the context of Vincent Chin in 1982 and how it does or doesn't resemble our moment right now, especially amidst the ongoing pandemic and anti-Asian violence.
Yeah, I definitely can. I'll start with how it resembles the movements, and I think a lot of the the hate is the same, the attacks, even the slurs and the racism is the same, sadly. So many of those things happened to me. I grew up in Oklahoma when we immigrated from Burma when I was 7, and the South is a whole nother entity in itself, but in a lot of ways, I think many parts of Michigan resemble where I grew up. And you see the ignorance. If you've never seen, met, or heard Asian American stories, this is what comes out of it. I will say what feels different, hearing the stories from the women on staff, many of whom were shaped by the legacy of Vincent Chin. They walked by the restaurants that he ate at. They met the people he talked to. They're also shaped by the legacies of other Asian American women like Grace Lee Boggs, Yuri Kochiyama. And to me, what feels different is, as a Southeast Asian American, I don't think I have ever really fit into the model minority myth in the way that a lot of East Asians may have. And also the legacy of activism and political empowerment that my parents have always bestowed on me, especially my dad, because he was a part of the uprisings in Burma in the 80s. I don't think many people in my generation are afraid to yell. They're not afraid to shout. They're not afraid to work against the state when needed. They're not afraid to work with the state when necessary. And I think there's like a fearlessness to my generation that I'm extremely proud of. I think Gen Z and millennials, late millennials, get a really bad rep. But as someone who has been shaped by my peers, as someone who has been shaped by organizing at UMich, you see these people on stage who taught many of us. I have a lot of hope. I think I read somewhere today that like resilience is a trauma response, and I look forward to the day when we don't have to be resilient. And I look forward to the day when my parents can return safely to their homeland. And I just think about how so many of us, whether because of social media or whether because of activism really taking the forefront because of the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think we have a hyper-aware generation and also a generation that is tired of all this bullshit.
Thank you, Jen. I wanted to turn it over to the audience and actually make a quick introduction. Leslie Krause-Stanbaugh is the chair of the Ann Arbor Human Rights Commission and was invited by us and Aisha Ghazi, who couldn't be here, to speak a little bit about the Ann Arbor Human Rights Commission and what folks can do, what resources are out there for in dealing with harassment.
Thank you, Ron. That's true, and I really appreciate what you folks have done. You've added so much to the film. I love what Francis said about the trauma of the Vincent Chin murder and how it brought people together and how people stand together. That we were talking about the same thing, the same kind of trauma now. We need to come together more. Human Rights Commission is a group of 9 people who were charged by the City Council and the mayor to take complaints about discrimination and harassment. We take our jobs very seriously. People are being harassed sometimes. You might see it, you might have it yourself. If you do, you said, let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair. Call us, report it, so that things can be done to make sure it doesn't happen to the rest of the community, so we can stand together. If I'm going to stand at the desk that we all checked in on, I'm going to pass out flyers, tell you what kind of complaints we take and how you can reach us. Try us for anything. We want to hear you. We want to fight for you. If you don't happen to have this with you and you see something that we ought to know about, Google Ann Arbor Human Rights Commission, and they'll lead you to us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. Are there, we have a couple minutes left. Are there any questions from the crowd? I know no one really wants, yeah. Is there a mic?
There's a mic here and there's a mic there.
Okay.
One of the more infuriating aspects of that film was the whataboutism and the scapegoating, which we see sort of very recently with attacks on the LGBTQ community. And, one of the things that oftentimes I was bothered by my guilty position is what can we do that's tangible and real. And one of the things I've been thinking about most recently that I'd love to get your input on is there's this radicalizing effect in right-wing media that's kind of the analog to what some might call our movement. And some of the arguments that the lawyer was making about, it's not really racism, it's anything but racism, right? There's this rhetoric, this really well-architected rhetoric around what the correct responses are. And I don't know how we fight that, and I would love to get your input on that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Did people hear it? Folks in the back? No? The question was a little bit about, how the film characterized the sort of whataboutism, like this sort of discrediting the narrative that this was a racist attack, and the lawyer said something about that to a similar effect, that this was anything but racist. So how does one combat, am I characterizing your question correctly? How does one come?
How do we fight back against a movement that's so well-funded, so well-organized, so coherent?
Right. How do we fight against a right-wing movement that's so well-organized and well-funded?
I think something that we're just living through in real time is the Uvalde massacre, and how the press and the media have unfortunately just, if you watched what you're talking about, the far right, their media, the way they distract from that was to start talking about anti-trans and drag shows. And I watched the entire country, the entire country's heart broke, and there was real anger. And it seems like this time is going to be different. And then that right-wing apparatus kicked in, and they realized, we're just going to start talking about, anti-drag shows, and you just watch the media landscape pick up that narrative, right? And it's horrifying, and you feel helpless. And I would say that the first thing we can do is to stay focused, and to realize that the manufactured outrage about very superficial, unimportant, cultural, not unimportant, but very it's just that kind of they're inciting outrage, right? About drag show book readings, and not about gun rights. So the very serious topics we're not supposed to be angry about. We're supposed to be angry about something that is fun and actually good for kids, right? And that's just nonsensical, and you feel like you're going crazy. And I think that is it, to stay focused. And some of my friends from high school that I've known over 20 years, I've watched them unfortunately become susceptible to this kind of messaging. And I think that the only thing I can do is, when I engage with them, I try to just really talk about the things that actually matter, that I know matter to them. But they're just given this kind of fishing line of just outrage crap that they can just kind of feel like they can divert to, and to not do it, as Dim was saying, you don't let them get away with it. And it's really hard, because these are guys that I've known my whole life, what feels like my whole life, and it's really hard, and but it's worth it. It's worth it because I know them, and I know where their heart is, and you really just have to have them focus and almost convince them and remind them of what they are actually about. And the other thing I would just say overall to the left is, let's just get some solid messaging going, because it's absurd at this point that the discourse on the left is really just lacking in, I don't know, it's maddening. I wish I had better advice for you. I don't know. Drink more coffee. That should help. Yeah.
Some practical tips. I've heard stories of people whose elderly parents are watching, or grandparents are watching Fox News, and they watch as they become more and more radicalized, and their whole personality changes. So some people, I'm told, I've heard, they use the parental controls on their elders' TVs to just cut that off. And then the elders go, why isn't my TV working? So, I don't know, TV's not working, right? So that's one practical tip that I learned. I think it's great. And then otherwise, you teach people to read, lots of different media sources. And I tell this to students. It's like, well, how do I know who to trust? I'm like, well, you take a few options and you go and you do the research. You go back to the original sources. You see who, you follow the research, And no one's going to have time to do it for every story that they do, but you do it a few times. Then you kind of figure out who is reliable and who can you trust. And then just do the research. Look, so for example, this is really easy nowadays. So if you want to watch like the January 6 hearings, the hearings, like a lot of PBS NewsHour, sorry, I don't mean to make commercial, but they're live streaming a lot of stuff. So what did the president say? You can actually go look at it. What did the president say? How do you interpret it yourself? And then you listen to commentators to help out. And I had one more tip. I forgot what it was.
I would say that's one terrifying thing, though, that goes back to what you're talking about, is the pipeline of disinformation, that the far right is very keen on making sure that people don't do what Francis is saying, is that do what you're supposed to do, is to look at different sources, that they're saying we are the truth and everything else is, propaganda. And, we are watching the fascist media apparatus happening in this country, and it's working, and it is terrifying. Dim.
Oh wait, I remembered my third point. Sorry. The third one is at the beginning of the 45th administration, a lot of people were saying, oh no, what do I do at Thanksgiving? How do I talk to my relatives about all this stuff? Well, if you're not going to talk to them, who is going to talk to them, right? There was this really powerful project at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter where young Asian Americans were trying to figure out how do we talk to our elders and explain Black Lives Matter to them. And they came together on a Google Doc. It broke records, the most people on one Google Doc at one time, and they crowdsourced a letter that respectfully and used culture said, dear mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, we love you, but you have to know that, we love our friends and our friends are Black. And this is and then they explained the Black Lives Matter in very down-to-earth, simple terms and then they translated all these letters into lots of different languages. And I think the power of that, and it was just a way, how do you talk to your elders, right? And they did it. It's called Asians for Black Lives. If you look that up, you'll find it.
Actually, I sent some of my parents the Burmese letter, and then one of my friends actually started translating a Chin letter, so that's our ethnic language, and then Burmese is what most people in Burma speak. And I think this is a good reminder that you should search for a political home, wherever that may be. That can be a group of friends, that can be a political organization, that can be an art club. Things like art is also really powerful. And something that we always talk about at Rising Voices is that there are multiple approaches to power, and we have to use all of them. And I think what gets really overwhelming about activism and organizing sometimes is that people want one solution to solve these multitudes of issues, but the thing is what you're doing in your lane with the people that and organizing in a culturally competent way, that is enough. If you don't see big change happen, it is still enough. And I think this is something that we're trying to do at Rising Voices. So we work with the state, against the state, and outside of the state, and that can showcase itself in a lot of ways. And I think also as a queer person, I really hear what you're saying, and going back to what people have said on stage, if you look at the substance of the arguments on the right, there is no substance, and actually trans activists have done more for them and their kids than they've ever done for their own children. And I think growing up in the South, it's been difficult to have those conversations with my parents, and it's been a long journey because my parents used to be registered Republicans. They used to be extremely homophobic and racist, and anti-Blackness racism, especially in the Asian community, is rampant. And the only way that my family and I have survived all of that is continuous conversation, and that is really, really hard. And that's also why I think healing is something that we don't talk about enough, is that we're not machines built to only be against things, built to only do activism, that we are also here deserving of healing. And something the Asian American community often lacks is healing justice. And I think that's also part of the work, is taking care of yourself, taking care of your community, whether that's mutual aid, therapy, anything like that. So I think the TLDR, the summary, is that there are multiple approaches to power, and the way that you're doing it is enough, and it's one part of the whole project.
Thank you so much. That's Such a beautiful note to end on. I just thank you again, everybody, for being here. I just wanted to just make a quick announcement. You might have noticed the tree outside. That is an art installation that was put together by Celeste Shimura-Goder. And
Celeste. Where's Celeste? She may have gone.
she might have, but I really encourage you guys. I really encourage you guys to kind of interact with it, and I'm sure the panelists, will be out there as well. Happy to speak with you.
Yeah, sorry, Mana, if I could really quickly, the Keys on a Tree is a co-presentation of Rising Voices, WDET, Detroit Public Television, and Island, the performance collaborative that Francis and I are a part of. And it actually really very much is about what Dim was talking about, is trying to provide an opening for conversation. And kizuna is a word in Japanese that means connection. And what we want people to really engage with is the connection between people, between their communities, between generations, and between, just to be able to talk to each other. And one part of it that we're working on is that there's a sound that comes from it, and those are conversations that Detroit Public Television and WDET have recorded with AAPI community members talking to someone in their life about their relationship. So what we would really like is for this piece to travel and have that kind of restorative, healing processes that Dim was talking about.
Thank you.
And it comes with a dance performance. So if you have a venue that you'd like to see this amazing performance, let us know.
Thank you, everyone.